For years, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were presented to the world as a single unit, a modern power couple breaking away from tradition, rewriting royal rules, and building a future on their own terms. But quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change, not in a dramatic headline moment or a public announcement, but in the small details people tend to overlook until they suddenly add up. The separate appearances, the solo projects, the different priorities, the subtle shifts in language, and a growing sense that Harry and Meghan were no longer moving as one synchronized force, but as two individuals slowly drifting onto parallel paths that no longer quite intersect the way they once did. And when you step back and examine the full picture, what emerges isn't a scandal or a sudden rupture, but something far more complex and far more revealing. A professional, emotional, and strategic separation that raises an uncomfortable question many observers are now asking quietly but persistently. Are Harry and Meghan still building a shared future? Or are they carefully constructing separate brands that no longer require each other to function? Not when Harry and Meghan first stepped away from royal life. Their strength came from unity. Every interview, every statement, every appearance reinforced the idea that this was a joint decision, a shared escape, a couple standing shoulder to shoulder against an institution they felt had failed them. And in those early months, their messaging was tightly aligned. They spoke as we, they framed their experiences as collective, and their ambitions appeared fully intertwined. But as time passed and the realities of post-royal life set in, cracks began to appear, not necessarily in their marriage, but in their direction, because once the initial adrenaline of leaving the royal family faded, the practical question emerged: what exactly were Harry and Meghan building together? And perhaps more importantly, what were they building individually? Harry, for much of his adult life, had been defined by service, military duty, charity work, and his role within the royal structure. Even after stepping away, those instincts never disappeared. He gravitated toward causes that felt familiar: mental health, veterans, wounded soldiers, environmental advocacy, and personal healing. His projects reflected a man still searching for meaning, still tethered emotionally to the world he left behind, while Meghan, by contrast, began leaning more visibly into something different: lifestyle branding, media presence, curated public image, and a reassertion of her individual identity beyond royal titles. And this difference wasn't sudden. It had always existed beneath the surface. But once they were free from palace coordination and royal protocol, those underlying priorities became far more visible. One of the clearest signals of this shift came through their public appearances, or more accurately, their lack of shared appearances. Meghan began attending events alone: tech summits, charity galas, fashion-adjacent gatherings, and industry-focused spaces where influence is measured less in titles and more in access, while Harry increasingly appeared solo at charity engagements, speaking events, and initiatives tied closely to his long-standing causes. And while some couples thrive with independent schedules, what raised eyebrows was not just the separation itself, but the consistency of it. The pattern suggested intentional division rather than coincidence. And for a couple once defined by their togetherness, that change was impossible to ignore. Language to begin to shift in interviews and public messaging. Harry and Meghan subtly adjusted how they spoke about their work. What once sounded like shared missions now felt distinctly individual. Harry spoke about my journey, my healing, and my purpose, while Meghan framed her endeavors around creativity, entrepreneurship, and self-expression. And again, none of this was inherently problematic, but it highlighted a divergence. Two narratives evolving independently rather than converging, and in branding terms, that matters. Because public perception isn't built on grand gestures alone, it's shaped by repetition. And the repetition increasingly told a story of separation. Financial realities added another layer of complexity. When Harry and Meghan signed high-profile deals with Netflix and Spotify, they were widely portrayed as a combined brand. the Sussexes as a package deal, but behind the scenes, those partnerships expose differences in approach. Harry's contributions lean toward documentary-style storytelling and advocacy, while Meghan's projects veered into lifestyle and personal narrative territory. And while both are valid creative directions, they don't always coexist comfortably under one brand umbrella, particularly when performance expectations aren't being met uniformly. And as some projects underperformed or stalled, pressure inevitably followed. Pressure that often forces couples to reassess what they're doing together versus what they might do better apart. The Netflix deal, in particular, became a quiet turning point. Initial enthusiasm gave way to scrutiny, output slowed, expectations shifted, and reports suggested a growing disconnect between ambition and execution. And within that environment, Meghan's desire to reestablish herself as a standalone lifestyle figure appeared to intensify, while Harry seemed increasingly uncomfortable in a world driven by image rather than impact. And that discomfort manifested not in conflict, but in withdrawal, fewer shared promotional moments, fewer joint statements, and more clearly defined individual lanes. Observers also began noticing changes in how each was received. Meghan, once positioned as a bold disruptor, faced mounting criticism for perceived overexposure, while Harry, paradoxically, appeared to regain some public sympathy when operating alone, particularly in contexts tied to veterans and mental health. And this contrast created a difficult dynamic, one partner gaining traction through separation, the other struggling under collective association. And when public response begins to reward independence, the incentive to maintain unity weakens, not because affection disappears, but because strategy evolves. Even their physical presence reflected this evolution. Meghan's appearances became increasingly polished, controlled, and image-forward, emphasizing confidence and autonomy, while Harry's solo outings felt looser, less staged, and emotionally raw, suggesting a man navigating unresolved feelings about his past and present. And body language experts and royal watchers alike pointed out how differently each appeared when apart compared to together. Meghan often projecting composure and command, Harry occasionally displaying tension when operating within the shared narrative. And while body language isn't definitive proof of deeper issues, it often reflects internal states people aren't consciously articulating. Another telling factor was the gradual reshaping of their inner circles. Friendships and professional alliances shifted. Meghan's network increasingly intersected with entertainment, tech, and elite philanthropic spaces, while Harry's connections remained rooted in military and charitable communities. And while couples don't need identical social circles, divergence at this level often signals differing worldviews, different definitions of success, and different end goals. And when those differences align with public branding, they become more than personal preferences. They become strategic indicators. Perhaps most revealing of all is how Harry and Meghan now frame their future. Early post-royal messaging emphasized building something together, raising a family while changing the world as a unit. But more recent narratives emphasize flexibility, personal growth, and individual fulfillment. Language that suggests optionality rather than permanence, not divorce, not separation, but adaptability. And in modern branding terms, adaptability often precedes independence because it allows each individual to reposition without triggering backlash. Importantly, none of this implies the absence of love or commitment. Relationships evolve, particularly under extraordinary pressure. And Harry and Meghan have faced pressure few couples could endure. But evolution doesn't always mean convergence. Sometimes it means recalibration. Two people adjusting to realities that no longer match initial expectations. And in their case, those realities include fame without structure, influence without hierarchy, and freedom without clarity. Conditions that magnify differences rather than smoothing them over. The idea of separate brands isn't inherently negative. Many high-profile couples operate successfully with distinct identities, But the question with Harry and Meghan is whether their separation is intentional collaboration or reluctant adaptation, whether they are choosing independence as a strength or defaulting to it as a necessity. And the answer isn't yet clear, but the signs suggest a relationship renegotiating its foundation, shifting from a united front against the world to a quieter coexistence within it. For Harry, the path forward seems rooted in reconciliation, not necessarily with the royal institution, but with himself, his past, and the unresolved grief that has shaped his life. His work increasingly reflects introspection rather than ambition, healing rather than expansion, and that journey doesn't always align with the fast-paced, image-driven world Meghan appears to be navigating. While for Meghan, the future seems focused on control, autonomy, and reinvention, shedding imposed identities and reclaiming authorship over her narrative, a goal that naturally requires separation from any framework that dilutes individual agency. And so, when people ask whether Harry and Meghan are still moving together, the most honest answer may be that they are moving forward, just not always in the same direction, not as adversaries, not as strangers, but as to individuals responding differently to the same upheaval. And whether those paths eventually reconverge or continue diverging will depend not on public opinion, but on whether shared values can withstand separate ambitions. What makes this story compelling isn't the speculation of a breakup, but the quiet reality of evolution, a reminder that leaving one institution doesn't automatically create another. And that freedom, while empowering, also exposes differences that structure once concealed. Harry and Meghan stepped away from the royal family to define themselves on their own terms. And in doing so, they may have discovered that those terms aren't identical. And that truth, more than any rumor or headline, is what makes their current trajectory so fascinating to watch. Because it isn't about scandal, it's about choice, identity, and whether love alone is enough to keep two very different journeys aligned.